when we look at that, as well as going back a bit, when you're not able to own a gun, own powder, to be able to protect your family, to provide for your family, then women of color, all women of color, are looking for some man to be able to support them, and you can only imagine the psychological chaos of the first generations that had to go through this and live through this. Unbelievable. But looking at what this did to women and how they were literally, it was worse than codependency. It was enslavement, in a sense, to me, that they were enslaved to their husbands because they didn't have any rights to do anything, and so that husband can treat them any kind of way, do anything to them, and there was no recourse. So, I guess there was two kind of slaves. There were those of color, but then there was also women, white women.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to call white women slaves. What I
Right, now you can see here Dr. Bateleur actually uses word spell doublespeak, if you're familiar with George Orwell, or you can call it lying, intellectual dishonesty, gatekeeping. This is why there's levels to information. So clearly here she's telling the truth about the fact that white people didn't exist in law, but she's having an issue here with actually admitting that white women were treated as property, which is no different from chattel slavery, and in many ways worse, because marriage is for life. So let's just go through the documents that I found. So we're going to jump straight into this one here, past newspapers. The Maori Messenger, Te Karere Maori, 14th of March edition, 1850. As we can see, it's given to us by the New Zealand government, and this is on white slavery. And this little section here just deals with the general attitude of what was going on in Constantinople, what we now call Turkey. So the Turkish law permits a plurality of wives, and the wealthier classes of the people maintain harems. These are rich, voluptuous mansions where female slaves, frequently purchased at an enormous cost, are immured and devoted to the sensual enjoyment of their masters. They are forbid the presence of other men, and pass their days in wanton luxury and idleness. This is a species of a wholesale concubinage, and its practice has made the Turk a term of reproach among more moral nations. It's quite interesting that, because they always say that Turkey will never be a part of Europe, and you sometimes wonder if it is connected with their history and bygone things that have happened that people tend not to forget, even though maybe the people who are living there are not the original people. And here we have now the main body of the article, white slavery. The Turkish slave dealers seldom bring arms to the Gurkhas, or if they do, merely of the ornamental kind, and powder also they bring only in small quantities, as presents for the princes and nobles. The Circassians are not usually willing to trade by barter for their beauties, preferring to receive their price in hard cash, and they do not appear to find any difficulty in obtaining gunpowder, even from the Cossacks on the Kuban, etc. In most instances, only the daughters of slaves or of freed men are sold, but even noblemen may occasionally be induced to part with their daughters or sisters for bright silver piastres, and the girls themselves, to whom, from their infancy, the ease and splendour of the life they are to lead in the Turkish harems has been painted in glowing colours, generally leave without much pain their rude mountains and their unnatural parents. Each vessel carries from 30 to 40 girls, crammed like herrings in a barrel, but they submit with great resignation to the sufferings of the voyage, soon to be exchanged for the joy of the magnificent city of the Sultan. It is calculated that out of 6 slave ships, 5 always reach their destination. It is calculated that out of 6 slave ships, 5 reach their destination. During the winter from 1813 to 1814, 28 ships sailed for the Caucasus. It is calculated that out of 6 slave ships, 5 always reach their destination. During the winter from 1813 to 1814, 28 ships sailed for the Caucasian coast, and 23 arrived safe with their cargoes, 3 having been burnt by the Russians, and 2 by their fair living freight swallowed by the sea. A Turkish captain in Europe related to me, apropos of these slave ships, the following anecdote. A few years ago, one of them sprung a leak out at sea, just at the moment when a Russian steamer was passing at some distance. The Turkish slave dealer, preferring even the air of Siberia to drowning, made a signal of distress, and the steamer came alongside, by whose assistance only the crew and passengers could be saved from inevitable destruction. But so deeply rooted in the Caucasian heart is hatred to the Russians that the blood of these girls rose at the thought of becoming the property of a despised Russian soldier instead of sharing the couch of a magnificent Turkish pasha. They raised a mournful cry as the Russian vessel approached, and some sprung desperately into the sea, while others plunged their knives into their hearts. The greater number of them, however, were carried on board the steamer and taken to Anapa, where they were transported to the Cossack country and distributed among the Cossacks of the line. I myself made the passage from Trebizond to Constantinople with dozens of these Circassian girls as deck passengers. They were mostly mere children of 12 or 13, very pale and thin, but with very fine and interesting countenances, and a certain wild fire in their black eyes. 2 only were carefully veiled, and their figures displayed more roundness of outline. They might be 18 to 20 years of age, and to these the slave dealer paid much attention, and frequently bought them coffee, of which the others got none. On my making some inquiry concerning them, he informed me that they were the daughters of a nobleman, had fine rosy cheeks, and were much fatter than the rest, so that they would fetch a much higher price at Stamboul than the others. For these beauties he hoped to obtain as much as 30,000 piastres. Of the others he spoke with great contempt, and said he should be glad to get 16 guineas apiece for them. This Turkish slave dealer was richly dressed in silks and furs, and, in spite of his detestable trade, was a man of pleasing manners. He informed me that since the Russian occupation of the Circassian coast, his occupation had become more difficult and perilous, but far more profitable. Formerly, when Greek and Armenian women were brought to the Constantinople market, one might get a beautiful girl as low as 10,000 piastres, while at present a well-fed, rosy-cheeked damsel from the Guril or Anshar. Oh, I thought that was Anshara. Yes, Adshara would stand one in as much as 40,000. Caucasus and the land of the Cossacks. So that's the article there we have on white slavery. Let's jump into the next article now, which is Jew history, not Jewish, they call it Jew history, talking about servitude and indenture within the Ottoman Empire with court documents, etc. So see you there. Today we're actually going to be covering some information that I discovered while trying to recover a whole slew of information that I actually lost. While I was doing my immigrants in Jamaica, I had storage issues and I had to do a complete reboot, so I've lost masses of information. One of them was about Jews and their movements, and it explains about how affidavits and court documents are a good way of finding info and data on people. So it's a great hint if you're actually searching for your ancestors. So, however, while trying to recover my documents, I found this, which actually fits perfectly with my White Slavs of Europe series, having covered England. Now we're going to be looking at Europe. So if you haven't watched my other videos, I suggest you do, and if you have, then you'll know that what we call Europe, including Russia and North Africa, was under constant war, they say, for at least 500 years, and these people were under a system of slavery under the Ottoman Empire. So I'm just going to give, before I start, a big shout out to content creators like Medicine Man, Kurumeu Ahu, UBTV, aka UB News, because they actually sit down and will actually put a documentary together, or a video that's a quality documentary together, that's easy to follow and easy to understand about our stories that haven't really been told. Then of course we've got the UK contingent, which is fantastic at putting on the lives, where they're again putting information together about a specific subject, a specific topic, so you can actually follow it and understand fully from A to B. Now I was doing that, but I've lost so much stuff that I'm actually worried about losing information again. So you're actually here with me, putting the pieces of the puzzle together with me. So here we go on slaves of Europe, which is going to be part 2, since we had a look at the slaves in England previously. What I've got here is Jew history, and it's blonde, tall, with honey-coloured eyes, Jewish ownership of slaves in the Ottoman Empire. Now, of course, this has come about because I was essentially searching for Jews in Jamaica, because I considered that perhaps they would have been one of the first lot of immigrants to arrive here, not necessarily prisoners of wars, but as traders and foreign dignitaries even travelling. So here we go, having a look at Europe. Now this is going to explain what this document is all about. It's by Yaron Ben Nair. It's a document from Springer Science Business Media, and I think it was published 2006. Now, what it's saying is that there's hundreds of Hebrew written sources, dozens of official decrees, judicial records. I'm not going to try to pronounce that for the moment, and reports of European travellers indicate that slaveholding, particularly of females of Slavic origin, in Jewish households in the urban centres of the Ottoman Empire was widespread from the 16th to the 19th centuries. This halakhical and legally problematic habit was an unparalleled phenomenon in any other Jewish community in the early modern period. The presence of slaves in Jewish households affected family life in many ways. I dealt with two of them. The first is cohabitation of Jewish men with female slaves, usually non-Jewish, who in effect served as their concubines and bore them legitimate children. The second is marriage with manumitted slaves who converted to Judaism and became an integral part of the community. This phenomenon attested once again to the great extent to which Jewish society and its norms and codes were influenced by Muslim urban society, and the gap between rabbinic rhetoric ideals and the dynamic daily existence of Jews from all social strata. And you can see here, this is all references here. These are all references from where the information to put this together has actually come from. So slavery and slaveholding has been among the most outstanding aspects of life in the various and varying Muslim societies over the centuries, as is reported by hundreds of Hebrew sources, dozens of official ordinances, documents produced by the Sharia courts, and the reports of European travellers. Slaveholding was also common among Jews. I'm just going to see if I can move this over without interrupting, being able to scroll. Okay. Sorry, we're just doing a bit of resizing here so everybody can see. Alright. And the reports of European travellers, slaveholding was also common among Jews in Muslim lands. The ownership of women in particular was widespread in Jewish households of the modern era. It was certainly far more common than in Jewish communities in North Africa or Europe. What we know about this practice may now be considerably enlarged thanks to my discovery of about 100 as yet unknown documents from the 17th century court registers of Haskoy, one of the quarters of Istanbul. These documents, especially as we will now study them alongside known rabbinic sources, prove information that both supports existing data and permits asking new questions. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire. Research on slavery in the Ottoman Empire first concentrated on economic and legal issues. The early studies of Ehud Toledano are especially noteworthy. During the past 15 years, research has concentrated on the existence of various classes of slaves, their mobility from one place and one master to another, and on bonds of loyalty and patronage. Growing academic interest in the history of women and minorities has drawn the attention of scholars to the lives of the slaves themselves. The first study dealing with slavery in the Muslim world in its Jewish context was an article published by Simha Asaf in 1939, who indicated how widespread Jewish ownership of slaves was, and who discussed the status of slaves under the heading of the law of the land and the halakha. Renewed interest in the subject began in the 1980s after the Ottoman archives were opened and in the wake of studies on Ottoman slavery in general. The first to enter the fray was Hiam Gerber, followed by Ovadia Salma. In the mid-1990s, Ruth Lambden wrote on slavish slaveholding in Syria and Palestine during the 16th century, which addressed the institution of halakhic and social aspects and focused in particular on the distress slaveholding caused the wives of owners. The sigil documents I have unearthed allow us to go further. Essentially, there is nothing unusual about this body of text. Applying to the Sharia court was a normal procedure whose purpose was to conform to formal notarial requirements, contracts of employment such as kitaba, and the manumission or transfer notarial requirements, contracts of employment such as kitaba, and the manumission or transfer of slave ownership necessitated legal registration with the Qadi, who then issued an official document, hujet, or a writ of manumission, itaknama. At times, manumission was made contingent on the continuance of wala, or kinship, which signified the former owner retained the right to inherit the freed slave, and which in turn presupposed mutual loyalty and something that resembled a patron-client relationship. The documents concern female slaves most exclusively. I found only one case concerning a male. Slavery thus seemed to have been limited to those who would provide household services of the kind exclusively performed by women, including sexual ones. This helps explain why nearly all the slaves were white females, principally of Slavic origin, captured during Ottoman campaigns or by their Tatar collaborators in Eastern Europe, with only a few of otherwise provenance: Circassian, Caucasian, Hungarian and Austrian. Black slaves are not mentioned. Physical descriptions of female slaves remark about fair hair and light-coloured eyes, although possibly this simply reflects the general characteristics of the captured and enslaved women. Male preference, however, should not be ruled out. Women too bought slaves, but most likely the traits women sought out were domestic skills, physical strength, and an obedient nature. Beauty for them was no doubt for the most part irrelevant, although it may have been they considered slave owning an act of conspicuous consumption, the slave being a beautiful object to be shown off. No wonder the documents speak of female slaves who were deformed and scarred. Many of the large majority of the women bought from the Balkan and Eastern European regions were originally Christians, and they identified accordingly as Nazrani, Isaviya, Militidin. When religion is not specified, we may assume that at least some of the women had converted to Judaism and were given Jewish names. Others retained their Slavic or Balkan birth names. Muslim slaves are not mentioned, although we shall see that Jews did hold Muslim slaves. The owners were individuals, both men and women. Sometimes the ownership was shared by several family members, whether as a result of purchase or inheritance, or even in partnership with neighbours. In most cases, the sources are silent about the duties of slaves or the substance of relations, particularly of the women, with their male or female masters. What little information we have comes from Hebrew sources, and it clearly points to female slaves performing household chores alongside hired servants. Many of them also served as concubines in what the documents indicate was, on the whole, relative harmony with the lady of the house. Writs of manumission registered in the courts often note too that the owners are freeing a female slave who had served them loyally and obediently. Jews freed their slaves using the same legal procedures, under similar conditions, and for identical reasons as did Muslims, most commonly in accord with kitabah, contracts. Manumission could usually come at the end of a set period, with or without payment. Indenture itself was generally for a set period of time, a few years of service, and at times no more than a year or two. Ilya, for example, who was the vakil and the eldest son of Avram, Veledi Elia, the Jew, who lives in the Keramitic Ahmed Celebi. Neighborhood in Haskoy, and whose vakil was testified by Yasaf, son of Mihail, and Ilya, son of Naham, the Jew, came to the court and reported on the presence of the Karii of the said Avram. Eponyi, daughter of Roman, who was tall, had blue eyes, detached eyebrows, and was of Russian origin. Abram said, he was Avram a minute ago. The said Abram made an arrangement with the said Eponyi that if she will serve him 4 years with loyalty, at the end of the period she will be free like the other free people. The said Eponyi accepted the agreement, and what happened was registered in 5 Seval 1090. Freedom might also be purchased by refunding the purchase price. Servitude might also end with the death of the owner or as an act of piety. Slaves who converted to Islam were usually removed at once from their former owner, whether Jewish or Christian. They were then entrusted to a Muslim custodian and sold only to Muslims. Conversion to Islam was not necessarily synonymous with liberation. To wit, the slave, together with her daughter, fathered by a Jew, her owner, from the Piripasi neighborhood, who was of medium height, blue eyes, reddish eyebrows, pointed nose, and her daughter converted to Islam. She was named as Gulistan, and her daughter was named as Gulbus. An earlier document says that Gulistan was handed over to Ibrahim Effendi. Upon the mother's conversion to Islam, both slave and child, here a daughter, were taken from the Jewish owner, father, and one imagines adopted by a Muslim. Another source documents an event that took place in Jerusalem in 1579. Fatma, the Muslim slave of the Jews, Mahaba, arrived before the court, said the Shahada, and thus formally converted to Islam, and consequently was turned over to the commander of the fortress. In mid-16th century, Bursa, a convert, possibly a former Jew, was flogged for selling a Muslim slave girl to a Jew. The author mentions the confiscation and sale of the Jewish Saraf's Russian slave that became Muslim. Jewish slave trading. Western sources repeatedly mention that Jewish men and women resident in Istanbul engaged in the buying, training, and sale of slaves, although at times slave trading was not that at all. but Jews ransoming Jewish captives, as was the tradition. A smaller number of texts nonetheless showed that Jews were involved in the slave trade as dealers. Turkish Esergi. A communal ordinance dating from the early 17th century also points to extensive Jewish involvement in the slave trade in Istanbul, as well as Karaites. The prologue reads, "Since within the holy community, may the Lord save it and keep it, there are individuals who negotiate to buy and sell male and female captives as male and female slaves. And there are also a few among them who buy slaves not in order to sell them, but to use them as slaves of their own, and is customary in the state from earliest times to pay the tax to the governor for the slaves, irrespective of whether one buys or sells slaves through negotiation in order to make a profit, or whether one buys them for himself." Like Banner, daughter of Havader, the slave, Kari, in Ototor, who is of medium height, detached eyebrows, blue eyes, has a dot on her right ear, and of Russian origin. I have manumitted my slave, and now she is free like other free people. A Jew who dealt in female slaves is mentioned in a question asked of a rabbinical authority at the beginning of the 18th century. Where the document leaves us in difficulty is that many references to Jews buying slaves do not specify whether they bought them for personal use or for resale. No doubt slave dealers kept several slaves in their homes for lengthy periods of time, until they could train and sell them to proper buyers. The basic skills slaves required were to perform household chores, like cooking and embroidery. To prepare them for service in Jewish homes, slaves had to be taught the Jewish dietary laws of kashrut. Since, in most cases, the slaves were females, much of the daily contact with them was through the woman of the household. Training the most accomplished slaves in anticipation of their resale took much time and included the acquisition of cultural skills needed for future service in the harems of the elite. One can easily imagine that newly acquired slaves were also taught Turkish singing, dancing, and how to play musical instruments. The teachers may well have been professional Jewish performers. The extent of Jewish ownership. Dozens of responsa dating from the 16th to the 18th century routinely mention Jewish slaveholders in the cities of the Ottoman Empire. The Sulhan Aruk, the Sulhan Aruk, sect Euredia 267, contains 85 clauses relating to slaves. That whole section of various halakhic works, some printed and others still in manuscript, are devoted to the presence of slaves and to problems and situations that emanate from it. Is another indication of slaveholding. Now I think that is really interesting, that this name Dia, Yoredia, because I have often come across a really similar name in sales, except it's Daath, and it's very awkward to phone if you're doing telephone sales and you phone and you say, "Oh, can I speak to Mr. Deaf, please?" So I always used to say Mr. Diath, and here we have it here. So is this a Khazarian name? because I'm not sure if it's a complete Jewish name. Okay, so we'll carry on. The printed works and others still in manuscript are devoted to the presence of slaves and to problems and situations that emanate from it, another indication of slaveholding's extent. These works even reproduce formulaic deeds for recording the purchase and sale of slaves, or outlining the procedures of manumission and conversion to Judaism. The frequent use of deeds lends a support to the assumption that ownership of slaves was widespread among middle and upper class Jews in medium-sized and large cities, and even in the provinces from at least the late 16th century until the middle of the 19th century. The sigil documents complement the response literature and attest to the fact that many women owned slaves, perhaps more than we would expect, and this makes them an important component in their assets. Court records reveal a wide range of prices which no doubt were influenced by the slave's physical attributes such as age, features and capabilities, and perhaps also by the length of service agreed upon. Records of income from taxes for the year 1691 through to 1692 indicate that the neighbourhoods of Haskoy and nearby Piri Pasha, where our documents originate, were poor. About 80% of the Jews living there paid the lowest tax rate, while only 16.5% were at the intermediate level, with less than 4% considered wealthy. Undoubtedly, more Jewish-owned slaves were found in neighbourhoods containing a good percentage of middle-class and wealthy Jewish females. Indeed, that the principal Jewish slave owners were of the Jewish upper class helps explain why the slaves Jews owned were themselves frequently considered high class. An outgrowth of their status was that wealthy new owners sought to maintain good relations between such slaves and their previous owners. These relations could be of considerable value, since they were a means of communication and sometimes influence. The religious and social aspects of the presence of slaves in Jewish urban households. Muslim law and the ownership of slaves. Non-Muslims were forbidden to own slaves, whatever their origin, a prohibition that dates to the time of the Mamluks, who feared lest the slave be converted to a religion other than Islam. They also did not want dhimmis, essentially Jews and Christians, to acquire this important status symbol, just as dhimmis were forbidden to wear luxurious clothing. Mamluk consistency and severity in enforcing the restriction seems to have gone by the borders under the Ottomans. Ordinances issued by the imperial court, beginning in the middle 16th century, to police the holding of slaves by dhimmis were neither uniformly enforced, nor were their directives themselves uniform. They also differed from place to place throughout the empire. The same applied to some other restrictions of Muslim religious law. At times, the holding of slaves was absolutely forbidden. On other occasions, only elder female slaves were permitted, and still others, what alone was forbidden was to own Muslim slaves. Documents published by Chaim Gerber indicate that official records register Jews and Christians owning only a few score female slaves, or the names of slaves Jews once owned. But there is good reason to believe that Jewish communal leaders kept the authorities in the dark about the true figures of what we see on paper reflects no more than what was decided in negotiations. This seems to have been the case even when enforcement was strict. Jews circumvented not only the general prohibition, but even that against acquiring Muslim slaves. often through the use of a Muslim intermediary to carry out the transaction. The 17th century French traveller de Hayes describes this method. He made special note of the difficulty in procuring beautiful female slaves, which some Jewish ladies, besides men, nevertheless managed to do by having a Muslim act on their behalf. It was also possible to offer a bribe. These practices might come to an end. However, when a new regime took power, or when Muslim anger at dhimmis flouting Islamic law periodically boiled over, leading to the strict enforcement of sacred Shariah's law. More pragmatically, supply and demand may have influenced official attitudes. A surplus of captives in the market both lowered price and made it difficult to resist dhimmi requests to purchase slaves. When, on the other hand, there was a dearth of slaves, these owned by dhimmis might possibly be distrained. Ottoman policy, as Gerber has succeeded in showing, generally changed. The absolute prohibition of slaveholding by non-Muslims gave way to ownership of slaves who were not Muslim, however, in return for the payment of a special tax. In the 1570s, Jewish communities, at least in the larger cities, apparently agreed to pay such a tax in return for the right to own slaves, which was likely paid in addition to the yizi, the poll tax paid by all dhimmis. We may assume that slaves owned by non-Muslims rarely converted to Islam, but more they adopted the religion of their non-Muslim owners. Procedures like this may well reflect various ordinances issued during the reigns of Selim II, 1566 through to 1574, and Murad III, 1574 through to 1595, concerning the enforcement of several Shariah's restrictions relating to dhimmis. Gerber also notes an ordinance from 1595 that permitted de facto dhimmis to own Christian and Jewish slaves. It may well be that the global tax paid for the right to own slaves is the one mentioned in the joint rabbinite Karaite communal ordinance issued in Istanbul in 1610, and later in other documents from the end of that century. Indeed, from the middle of the 17th century we hear no more of such restrictions, and it is obvious that Jews were permitted to own female slaves in return for payment of a payment tax. The impact of this new policy is reflected in a reposum from 1570 by R. Moshe Mitrani, then residing in Safed. He mentions the acquisitions of slaves in the cities of Syria, Palestine and Egypt after the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus in 1570, noting in particular the purchase of adults and juveniles from among the Cypriots. The local Muslim population, he adds, appealed to the Sultan to have this practice stopped. Their efforts clearly failed. There were even dhimmis who acquired male and female Muslims as slaves, although this was wholly prohibited, and despite the danger of severe punishment that owning a Muslim slave might entail. It is unclear why Jews were willing to run the risks involved in such ownership. Perhaps a death of Christian slaves on the market led to taking chances, and why Muslim slaves owned by dhimmis stayed put and did not leave their masters. Perhaps the key to this last was good treatment, but this is to speculate, as well as to wonder whether these slaves saw the option of enslavement to a Muslim owner as an unattractive alternative. What is to be more wondered at is why neighbours, relatives and others maintained silence before the authorities, even though they likely knew of the illegal presence of these Muslim slaves in Jewish homes. Religious issues. The presence of non-Jewish slaves in Jewish households posed halakhic problems, especially when dealing with food. Was the food slaves touched, even accidentally, and especially wine, still kosher? And what about the work slaves performed on the Sabbath? The legitimization of illegal offspring was especially thorny. The obvious solution to convert the slave was not free of contradictions. The slave could touch and prepare all food, but he or she could not be made to work on the Sabbath. Apparently, most Jews preferred not to convert their slaves, even though at times this was against the explicit wishes of the latter. It was deemed preferable to take advantage of having non-Jewish members in the household. Many rabbis, need it be said, were critical of this practice. Sexual relations with a female slave was a particularly acute problem, distinct from Islam, which gave slave owners the right to sexual intercourse with female slaves, whose offspring also belong to him and are considered legitimate heirs. Judaism tends to prohibit this practice, at least before the fact. Maimonides had already ruled that a man who engages in sexual relations with his slave must free her and marry her as a convert to Judaism, or send her away from this household. Oh, that sounds a bit biblical. Much of the reason for the prohibition was the prevention of halakhic infractions. First, of the rule against cohabiting with a non-Jewish woman, and second, the laws of menstrual separation. To be sure, these issues did not arise first in Islamic lands. What I believe was new was there was the increased concern among halakhic authorities. Cohabitation with slaves had not only become a somewhat common, but the general Jewish population considered it acceptable. The sources offer two justifications for ignoring earlier prohibitions. The female slave was bought with my money, and I am permitted to do whatever I want with her. Oh, I've lost my place. The sources offer two justifications for ignoring earlier prohibitions. The female slave was bought with my money, and I am permitted to do whatever I want with her. The price of payment was also her marriage price. Muslims were saying similar things, and it is clear that norms customary in Muslim urban society were influencing Jews. But there was the halakha, and illuminating in this context is a responsum of Rabbi David ibn Zimra, Zadbaz d. 1573, who lived principally in the land of Israel and Egypt. You requested that I inform you of my opinion about a concubine, whether she is permitted in our days or not, and if you prefer to say permitted, if she in a state of marriage or not, as I have seen some persons of our times transgressing in this matter, and at times committing a sin, for which the punishment is karet, since she is ashamed to go to the ritual bath, and he who uses her is cohabiting with a menstruant. Although the Radbaz was aware of the halakhic possibility of permitting the practice, he chose to prohibit it completely, perturbed as he was by the apparently inevitable violations of the laws of
corresponds with the impression. The birth of Manchester Union, while registering the causes of death, the cause assigned by a laboring man for
the nida, menstruant, that would ensure. But rabbinic opinion often differs from that of the public. A case from 17th century Salonika, known from a reposium of Rabbi Chaim Shabbatai, reveals a Jewish public divided on the social acceptability of cohabitance with slaves. It also unmasks the kind of rumour that relations with a slave might generate, as well as the fact that sometimes these rumours were true. Reuben bought a female servant from Simon who, immersed in the ritual bath, he bought her for the purpose of slavery, and it was obvious that he intended to fornicate with her, so much so that malicious rumours spread about that he was indeed fornicating with her. The rumour spread throughout the city, and Reuben, first of all he's Reuben, now he's Reuben, for his part unashamedly admitted to his actions, even boasting that he lay with her whenever he wished, and no one could tell him what to do, because he had bought her with his own money. And some of those who fear the Lord, when they heard of this evil, and that is truth was well attested, and that Reuben and the slave both admitted it, rebuked him. They said, "What and why are you doing this? How can you commit this great wrong and sin before God? For the severity of this sin is well known." Following the usual rabbinic path, Shabbatai ordered communal leaders to punish Reuben severely. Reuben himself was required to repent of his deeds, neither of which probably happened, although it is clear from the responsum that public opinion both justified and condemned Reuben's actions. There were even those who assaulted Reuben in his home. Rabbi Yosef Karo, too, the mystic and author of the most important halakhic works of the period, the Beit Yosef and Shulchan Aruch, considered intercourse with a female slave a grave offence. However, this did not prevent Karo from discussing the legal status of the offspring of a female slave at length. Karo suggested that the violators, who we may imagine were not few, free and convert beautiful women slaves and marry them to limit to one man the effects of this woman's obvious sexual attractions, and thus to ensure that other men did not fall into sin. Wow. Other mystics and Kabbalists took an even graver view of intercourse with slaves. In one chapter of his Reshit Chochmah, devoted special prayers to be said by one who spills semen extravaginally. Our Elijah Davidas also speaks of men who lie with menstruants, whores, non-Jews, and slaves, all of whom he condemns to severe punishment. Poems of reproof and ethical writings from the 16th through the 18th centuries also chide offenders. Clearly the offence itself was a common one, yet on the whole halakhic authorities seem to have resigned themselves to reality, and they limited themselves to condemnations, prescribing mild punishments, if at all. No doubt they understood that to decree harsh punishments would be to issue rulings with which the public could not nor would not abide. It would have been exceedingly difficult to prevent Jews from doing what was so widely accepted by Islamic urban culture as socially legitimate. I think it's a good point to drop off at this point. We can go into the more complicated matters actually of sex, slaves, sexuality and the family. because this is when it all starts getting really interesting, because you've got the Muslims who are saying, well, yeah, you know, if a man has laid with a woman, regardless of she's a slave, and produced offspring, they are legitimate heirs. But you've got the Judaic side going, oh, no, 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 they're bastards, which is similar to what we were reading in UK slaves, when Cobden was complaining that the main thing that was going on in England was what? Bastardy, where women were having children out of wedlock. So we can see that there's a very church orientated view of that, whereas the Islamic view, or let's say Muslim view, as opposed to Islamic view, was that once slave or no slave, once the man has produced a child, that is a legitimate, that child would have legitimate rights, contractual rights basically. So let's leave that off there, and we'll continue with that on the next edition of White Slaves in Europe.
On biracial children. Is that correct? That if you, it was called an abomination. If you, at what point did that come about?
Right. Well, now you're shifting into the United States of America, right? Because
Oh, okay. So I've already. Okay. So I'm sorry. Was there more?
Okay. Well, look. Well, so maybe we can.
I thought it was all one and the same. I didn't know.
Well, I'll give you some facts that'll prove you're right. But let's maybe we can wrap up sort of this colonial moment when white people first appear in law as this group of humanity. And here's what I think this history reveals to us. It reveals to us that this invention called white people is ultimately about the assertion of power by the 1%. Number two, that this group, white people, was invented to divide laborers from each other. And really, we've served that purpose ever since. And we can also say that white people, this group, was built upon the idea of the British as white, as Christian, and as privileged in relation to other people whose rights could be denied.
Okay. Wow. All right.
And we had 100 years from that invention to the founding of this nation.
Wow.
So this idea got to build over time and enter the hearts, minds, and practices of people.
This is why it's always important to bear in mind that the information that we're receiving, be it a book or something that we're watching, is always going to be coloured and influenced by the creators' social conditioning and their attitudes in general. Because while Dr. Bateleur was actually brave enough to state that white people were non-existent in law, she is still actually, in a way, holding up a part of the system by not wanting, by refusing to admit that white women were slavery, and historically slavery did exist in Europe and in America. The white slaves of England. She wants to define the type of slavery that white women were under, because she wants to maintain a class issue, even though she knows that the creation was done to create the class system. She still doesn't want to reduce herself to the status of a black man or a black woman, wanting to define different types of slavery. So you can see there's a class issue there, and there was also a class issue even amongst the slaves, so who they were owned by, the types of indenture that they had, the types of servitude that they were under. You can see some people were trained up to cook, to clean, especially if they were going to be in Jewish households, so they had to have certain skill sets. So again, we can see that it was clearly a form of work, of employment, which came with contractual obligations. She's not addressing those things either. Whether individuals adhere to the contracts or not is another matter, because as we can see from the court documents and affidavits that I've just gone through, sorry that I struggled with some of the names and the words, that people were being taken to court, and I'm pretty much sure that there are lots of court documents in America too, which will prove exactly the same thing. Now, what you have to bear in mind also is that if European women were not under some form of serfage, if they weren't under some form of slavery, why did women start to fight for things like the right to vote, equal pay? We've had so many different types of women's movements now, to the point now we actually get a ridiculous movement called Me Too. So this is why it's always important to pay attention to the information that you're taking in, because there's levels to it. And again, why it's important to do your genealogy, because as you can see, people can withhold the truth, people can not tell you the whole truth, because I'm pretty sure that if we looked in a law dictionary and we looked up property, we would see that basically you're owned. If you're owned, then you're not free. If you're not free, what are you? You're what we define today as a slave. So the next video that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be looking at the creation of the other, which is the boogeyman, the bad man that we've always